Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's Sticky Notes. So, Sticky Notes, for those of you who don't know, is something that we do every 2 weeks, and we present something about strategy, research, product design, anything we're kind of interested in, and just spend about 15 minutes talking on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn. And this week, I'm going to be talking about inclusive design. A lot of this talk will be drawing from examples in the articles, books, and talks from Kat Holmes, who was the principal designer at Microsoft and led a lot of their progress in accessibility and inclusive design. I always like to start off with, what does it mean? Well, that's actually the difficult part, because although everyone may agree on the definition for what inclusive means, the term inclusive design can often be interpreted differently for a number of reasons, but some may think it's just a case of making your website pass accessibility guidelines. On the other hand, people may think it's more just a case of having a diverse range of ethnicities in the images that are on your website. However, it isn't just one thing or one set of rules that you have to follow. It's actually more helpful to think of inclusive design as a process or methodology, one that allows us to draw on the full range of human diversity and learn with a range of different perspectives and inputs, all with the aim of reducing exclusion. So, what causes exclusion? We all know what it feels like to be excluded, but have you ever thought about what can trigger that feeling? Kat Holmes explores this in her book called Mismatch. And the title of her book comes from the World Health Organization's definition of a disability, which was redefined to better shape people's perception of what a disability really is. So, disability is not just a personal health condition, which is what we more commonly think of when we hear that word. It is actually the mismatch of human interaction. So, when a person's interaction with the world around them doesn't match what is expected or what is considered the norm. And experiencing those mismatch interactions can lead to that feeling of being excluded. So, how can we reduce those mismatch interactions in design? Well, to start with, we need to think of disability in those broader terms. So, thinking of it more than just a health condition. It's key to recognizing the other ways that people can be excluded and experience those mismatches. So this was a great example in one of Kat's talks. This is a bridge just outside of Manhattan, and it was designed by a man called Robert Moses in the 1930s. He did a lot of work across New York. Can anyone think of how this bridge could create exclusion? You would think a bridge would usually aim to bridge a gap and create more inclusion. But Robert Moses was documented as being an incredibly racist person, and when he built this, he designed the bridge to be just short enough that a public bus could not fit under it. Buses were the primary method of transportation for low-income families and working-class African Americans, which means they couldn't travel to the beaches and parks that were just outside the city. It created a literal barrier for people. Another way we can look to reduce exclusion is recognizing our own biases, as it can be an easy way to create those mismatches in a user's experience of a design. In the previous example, it may have been intentional in the decision, but we can also create these barriers without even realizing it. So when we are making design decisions, we are often basing it on what we believe works for everyone. But that is based on our own ability, learning style, educational background, and general experience of the world. which means that it will more than likely work for people of a similar background. But if those decisions are not made with the input of others and other perspectives, it will often create a mismatch between anyone who does not fit that same background as the person who's making those design decisions. An example could be if we were basing design decisions on questions we asked in a research survey. We may be asking those questions in a way that makes sense to us, but perhaps we're using unnecessarily complicated language, which in turn may not be understood by those whose educational background is different, or perhaps English isn't their first language. Kat Holmes suggests that when you look at the parts of the process, always think of who's going to be excluded in this piece of work, and is there anything we can do to reduce that exclusion? So in this example, perhaps we test the reading and comprehension of the questions before sending it out and adapt to make it as simple as possible, allowing more people to provide feedback and input and opinions before we make these design decisions. Another interesting point Kat made is around the concept of the average person. When we're designing, we can often fall into the trap of designing for this average person or user. Well, in Kat's talk, she explained the story of the engineers who were designing fighter jets during World War II. When they were designing the flight deck, they based it on the average measurements of a pilot. Things like their height, weight, arm span. They measured 4,000 pilots, which is quite a lot, and they believed the average of those measurements would be representative of the ideal pilot. But then the new planes began to be involved in a number of crashes, and no one could work out why. However, just before the Korean War started, a junior researcher decided to test defined average measurements and measure another 4,000 pilots. And when he did, he discovered that none of them matched the defined average pilot's measurements. It's much easier to think that designing for the average person may be the best way to help the most people. But that isn't always the case. And like in the example we just discussed, it can even be detrimental. And it really does get in the way of inclusive design to think only of this average person. So expanding the definition of a disability and moving away from the concept of just designing for this average user is really important when it comes to inclusive design. Now, I've shown these to the team before, but these are from the Microsoft's Inclusive Design Toolkit. And it really helps illustrate how accounting for those mismatches that someone who has a health condition experiences can also help others in similar situations. And that is because disability is more than just a health condition. An example could be adding subtitles and closed captions to a video. Yes, it helps someone who is hearing impaired, but it can also help someone who's just working from a really noisy coffee shop. So, what can we do? Firstly, I think it's important to recognize that inclusive design will take effort to implement. It's not necessarily hard, but it's always going to be, it's not going to be as easy as just running an accessibility software on a website. It will require us to challenge our thinking and decisions at every single stage of the process, considering whether this decision will increase or decrease the mismatch between the user and the design. We also need to understand that as much as we want to wave a magic wand and make everything inclusive, it will take some time for us to embed things into our process that remove those barriers at every part, from research strategy to design. It may not be something that we can do overnight, but it's definitely something that we can start working towards going forward. And creating impact how do we create impact through inclusive design? Well, actually, thinking of inclusive design as a process really helps highlight the fact that it should never just be one person's job to make the work inclusive, because there are many people involved in the process, which is why to have the biggest impact, everyone needs to show that they have some knowledge of inclusive design practices, so that at every part of the process, inclusivity can be thought about. If a designer comes in at the end and makes their design inclusive, it's not going to have as much impact if it wasn't built upon research that didn't include a diverse range of users. So essentially, we can have a bigger impact if we all individually play a small part in removing as many barriers as we can in whatever part of the process we are involved in. It should never be just one person's responsibility. So to summarize, we need to work on recognizing exclusion in our current processes and designing ways to reduce them as much as we can. We need to challenge our thinking more by understanding that disability is more than just a health condition, it's those mismatched interactions. And do our best to always try and learn and gather input from a range of people. And that's it. I hope you enjoyed it. And there are some links and resources I found during my research. I'm not sure if there are any questions, but I can always respond to them on all of the social medias that we are streaming to. Thanks. I think we are obviously taking a break over Christmas, but we should be back in the new year.